and just reminding everyone that when we're talking about embodied carbon, we're really talking about materials and their impact. We often get into the nitty-gritty of, carbon intensity and GWP numbers, but it really is more inclusive, health impacts, environmental, circularity, all those types of things. And again, we're mostly focused on structure and envelope, as those have about 90% of the embodied carbon emissions in a typical high-rise building, which is what we are most likely to see in Buckhead in the future. And again, when we're talking about the building materials and their impacts, those impacts are immediate and they're realized upfront at the beginning of a building's life cycle, and that's why embodied carbon is often called upfront carbon. So at Livable Buckhead, we have a role on the Development Review Committee. So when new construction projects submit their SAP, they come before us and we have an opportunity to influence some of their decision making. So we see that as a really important role at the beginning of the project when some of the biggest embodied carbon impacts can be made. And just want to go over again briefly our relationship with ULI going back 2 years. We've done 2 MTAP projects with them. In 2023, the first MTAP, that group created an embodied carbon action plan for us, which outlined a pathway forward us on our embodied carbon journey. The first steps were really focusing on education and awareness. Next steps were suggested of building a baseline for the community, and then moving towards maybe some type of voluntary reporting program or publishing lists of recommended building materials, and then in the long term, updating our zoning code to incorporate some type of either reporting or reduction policies. So really focused on convening these stakeholder groups, encouraging conversation around the value and importance of reducing embodied carbon, and increasing the transparency for our building materials. So our next MTAP went to try to build a baseline for the community, but that proved to be a little bit difficult. So they took a little bit more of a theoretical approach. They looked at the composition of a typical high-rise multifamily building and used the EC3 tool to input, typical building materials and come up with a baseline. They then ran the numbers again with lower carbon materials to see what kind of carbon reductions were achievable. And they determined with simple, highly available materials in the area in different design practices, they could easily get about an 11% carbon reduction. And if they wanted to push the limit a little bit more, found that up to 22% reduction was feasible for our market. They then looked at the availability and cost of these proposed lower carbon materials in the Atlanta market, and they found that for the most part, they are pretty readily available and did not have a significant price increase. And then again, as Denise mentioned, we wanted to take it to the community at large and see what people thought. Unsurprisingly, most people didn't know what embodied carbon is, but then once they learned, they considered it at least somewhat important for us to address. So we've been investigating what other cities have been doing to address embodied carbon emissions. And it does seem like this initiative is led by cities, not as much at the federal level. There are some federal Buy Clean programs. Who knows where those will go now. But we've been really encouraged by seeing the cities that have been adopting these policies. It seems like they've been getting really innovative projects and can spur some kind of innovative economic development that we would like to see in the Buckhead neighborhood. Our second MTAP also investigated what these policies actually are. Most of them fall into 2 categories, either prescriptive or performance-based policies. The prescriptive policies often regulate specific materials like concrete, steel, and then they cap the GWP limits for the available materials to be used for those projects. And then the performance-based programs usually require a whole building life cycle analysis to measure and minimize the building's impacts. So the goal for these workshops is to determine which path might work best for us and what the development community is prepared for. And then again, so our last workshop, the goal is really to level set with everyone, get everyone up to speed, and understand the importance of embodied carbon, and kind of get into an agreement that this is something that can differentiate the Buckhead neighborhood, spur economic development, and attract high-end tenants that really valuable sustainable development. So we went over our NPAPs in a little bit more detail. We heard from Alexander Kirk from Jamestown about their mass timber project at 619 Ponce, and I think that was really awesome. Really great to hear that you guys were able to attract some high-end tenants that were really had ESG goals and were looking to place themselves in a building that checks their boxes. We heard from Teresa at Multi Studio. She went over the tools that they're using internally to measure their embodied carbon intensity and really did an awesome deep dive on the availability of EPDs for the high impact products in the Southeast. So I think it was really encouraging to see that there is a pretty robust database out there at our disposal. We heard from Austin and Lead about what they are doing to address embodied carbon, and then had a great panel of our local firms that talked about how they're addressing their sustainability goals. So a little bit more about Austin and what we liked about that program. They've definitely been at this for much longer than us, I think 20, 30 years. So they've built up this program kind of as an alternative to LEED certification. It has a lot of those similar characteristics where you can pick and choose different pathways to get points. Buildings get a 5-star rating system. And I thought it was interesting. They have different zoning districts where they can require buildings to meet different categories. So maybe this little green district just requires a 1-star achievement rating, but maybe their Class A neighborhood in pink up here pushes their projects to get 3 stars. So that was really interesting. They also had the ability to offer some incentives for projects to go above and beyond their rating requirements. That is a little bit more complicated in Atlanta, but something that we would definitely like to pursue with the city. One thing that all projects going for the certification are required to do is submit data, quantitative data on their high impact materials. So it's not really a prescriptive or performance-based approach right now. It seems like they're really trying to build a baseline to eventually get to that reduction goals. So all projects have to list quantities for these listed materials. They have a really awesome spreadsheet that already has average GWP characteristics for those building materials, but folks can put their cost data in. If they have EPDs specific for their materials, they can put them in there. It'll calculate their reductions versus a baseline. So that is a really awesome tool that they have developed. Some other ways that you can get points in their program are by utilizing 20% of local or recycled materials, submitting EPDs for all of your concrete, submitting EPDs for 20% of all your other building materials on a cost or GWP basis. An innovative one that I liked was you could write a letter to 10 different product manufacturers requesting that they submit their products to EC3 to continue to build out that database and make it more robust. They also have a bunch of different points for conducting a whole building life cycle analysis, and then additional points for reducing your building from that baseline, and also creating a deconstruction waste plan. And this one is similar to LEED's proposed embodied carbon requirements. Projects can put all their high impact materials into the EC3 tool, again, calculate their baseline, and then at the end of the project, put in their actual EPD product specific information. So that is something that we were very intrigued by. And then again, LEED V5, they are going for the more performance-based route this time, supposedly. We'll see what actually comes out. But they're requiring all projects to conduct a simple LCA for the structure and enclosure and identify the top 3 sources of embodied carbon and talk about their strategies to reduce them. So kind of embodied carbon action plan-esque there. And this is a really big change from their previous version. And requires project teams to really start thinking about embodied carbon early on in the design of the building. So then after we heard from a lot of great speakers, we had a great panel discussion with our local firms. We learned that outside of the legal requirements going on, a lot of our folks are making embodied carbon commitments to their industry associations. So AIA 2030, SE 2050. A lot of our folks are reporting on their own project level embodied carbon data to these national databases, which are then working to create a more national baseline for buildings. And despite changes in federal policy, it was encouraging that a lot of our folks said that they think this is a lasting industry trend, and a lot of the actual better embodied carbon decisions are becoming the norm without regulation. So again, that was really encouraging to hear. Let's see. Also got a lot of input on the best time to make decisions about embodied carbon in the building design process. And pretty much everyone was saying that it's best to make those decisions early on in the process. So at our stage, when we have the impact on the SAP, it really aligns with being able to make an impact there. So again, key takeaways. A lot of the architects and engineers are already focusing on embodied carbon, even if they're not always vocalizing that to their developers. It seems like there's a preference for the performance-based regulatory approach because there is more flexibility in how you achieve those goals. Preference for alignment with other city and industry reporting programs. We don't want to reinvent the wheel in Buckhead. We want to make it easy for everyone to continue on with what they're doing, and starting small and nudging project teams early in the process can still have a significant impact. I want to open it up to the room. If anyone other takeaways from the first session?
A question on the last bullet.
Yep.
So based on the timing of the SAP process,
Mm-hmm.
the amount of work to get to an SAP beginning with a set of documents, you're sort of beyond the early stages of design and early decision making. So it seems to me that the SAP might actually be too late in the process if you're trying to influence the judgments of a team to make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who builds a lot of steel, concrete, and aluminum buildings across actually just about every one of those markets, to me, it just seems that you've got to come up with some type of early document that says this is the types of things you need to be making, like for lack of a better word, a developer's guide.
Mm-hmm.
That puts the guide in the hands of not just the architectural and engineering community, but puts it back in the hand of the developer and say, hey, this is appropriate streetscape look, this is appropriate front, retail look. But by the way, we really want you to think about your skin, your structure, here's some checklists, here's some resources, all these things that are in this document.
Yep.
And how you get that into sort of like a 101 primer, because the more education that actually comes that way versus, as you said, a lot of times the architects don't even tell you, hey, we can run this for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the SAP is too late in the stage to be trying to create that education or that decision for a development team to say, no, this is something we're going to try to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a perfect lead into what we're talking about today, and figuring out what exactly we can put out there to signal to developers that these are the things we prioritize. What we have kind of come to the conclusion is that asking the development team to submit embodied carbon action plan at the SAP stage to let us know how they are planning to tackle the enclosure and structure. This is just an example of Cambridge, Massachusetts embodied carbon action plan, where they just ask the developers to put out goals or tell us what your approach to addressing your three biggest materials. So we're going to try to get into the nitty gritty of what exactly we would like to see in maybe something like this today, and also talk about the not just the code itself that we could change, but also other ways we as a industry can influence the Atlanta market, and how we can bring more low carbon choices to the area. So
stepping back to our very first MTAP, the first thing we're doing is education. So we absolutely agree with you, John, that we've got to kind of put those resources out there and make sure that people understand what it is we're really kind of wanting to have done. So we're working a lot on that front, and actually this whole session is one more step on that education, getting everybody together. But our website, we are actually bringing a lot of those documents and resources together to make sure that there is a good local narrative on what it is we're looking for.
I just want to mention there is ULI Atlanta has produced a developer's guide to embodied carbon, which is kind of exactly what I'm pointing to. So maybe one recommendation that comes out of this workshop is kind of a localized, nuanced version.